A child vanished into the swamp, and what came back might not have been him at all. The summer of 1912 in Opelousas, Louisiana was stifling. The swamp air smelled of rotting vegetation, hot mud, and fish scales that stuck to the skin. On the morning of August 23rd, Percy and Leslie Dunbar packed up their children, Bobby and Alonzo, for a family fishing trip at Sway's Lake. They could not have known that by sundown, their names would be forever burned into American true crime history. Bobby, only 4 years old, was described as adventurous, bright-eyed, and bold. He darted along the water's edge, chasing frogs and skipping pebbles into the shallow reeds. But then, silence. The kind of silence that makes a mother's heart freeze. Leslie called his name once, then again, voice rising into panic. Percy sprinted into the marsh, shoes sinking into muck, his hands clawing through tall grass. The search widened quickly. Fishermen abandoned their lines, neighbors poured in, lanterns flickered as the sun dropped into the cypress horizon. Tiny footprints were discovered leading into the reeds, and then they stopped. No struggle, no splash, no trail, just the crushing stillness of the swamp. The town launched one of the largest search operations Louisiana had seen. They dragged nets across the lake, pulling up fish carcasses and the sickly sweet stench of drowned animals. Dogs sniffed along the muddy banks, whimpering when the trail vanished. Some whispered of alligators. Others muttered of gypsy kidnappers, drifters who passed through town unnoticed. Theories spread like wildfire, and suspicion hung over every stranger. As night fell, the atmosphere was suffocating. The cicadas' hum swelled into a deafening chorus. Lantern light danced on the water's surface, casting shadows that looked too much like reaching hands. Leslie collapsed in tears, her cries echoing into the swamp. Percy swore they would not leave until their son was found. But the swamp gave nothing back. How does a child simply vanish without a sound, without a trace? Days stretched into weeks. Search parties dwindled. Hope withered. The Dunbars' grief curdled into obsession. They offered rewards, pushed the newspapers for coverage, begged the authorities not to give up. 8 months later, a child was found in Mississippi, alive. But was he really Bobby Dunbar? Or had something even more sinister happened at Sway's Lake? Hundreds searched the swamp, but the deeper they looked, the darker the truth became. By the second day of Bobby's disappearance, Sway's Lake was no longer a quiet fishing spot. It had transformed into a war zone of desperation. Farmers, fishermen, and townsfolk poured in, their boots squelching through mud, their lanterns glowing against the suffocating August heat. The air reeked of sweat, swamp rot, and kerosene smoke as rowboats skimmed across the murky water. Men shouted Bobby's name into the cypress groves. Dogs strained against leashes, barking wildly, then whimpering when their noses met stagnant pools. Women lined the shore, clutching shawls and rosaries, whispering prayers over the thick hum of cicadas. The lake was dragged with nets and grappling hooks, and they pulled up bodies. Not Bobby, but bloated animal carcasses, half-eaten fish, and bones that looked disturbingly human. Each discovery sent shockwaves through the crowd, hope clashing with horror. "He's here," some muttered. "The swamp swallowed him." But Percy Dunbar refused to believe his son had drowned. He demanded more men, more boats, more nets. The search expanded beyond the lake into the forests and farmland, even into nearby towns where strangers were eyed with suspicion. Theories began to divide the community. Some insisted Bobby had been taken by alligators, swift, silent, leaving no trace but blood in the water. Others whispered about gypsy kidnappers, a scapegoat for every unexplained crime of the era. A few claimed they saw a strange man leading a boy away from the lake. A set of tiny footprints reappeared miles from the water, leading toward the railroad tracks. But the trail ended abruptly, as if the boy had been lifted off the earth itself. Days became weeks. Hope curdled into dread. The Dunbars clung to each rumor, no matter how wild. Percy's eyes grew hollow, his face marked by sleepless nights. Leslie carried Bobby's small shoes in her hands, pressing them to her chest like relics. Was Bobby Dunbar swallowed by the swamp, or stolen by human hands? The newspapers seized the story, branding it a Southern mystery. Headlines screamed of tragedy, feeding the public's fascination with the missing child. The Dunbars became symbols of grief and perseverance, but also of suspicion, as whispers arose that perhaps their wealth and influence were shaping the investigation. 8 months later, a boy was found wandering with a drifter in Mississippi, and the nightmare took a new, twisted turn. When fear grips a town, every shadow becomes a suspect. Opelousas, Louisiana, had never seen panic like this. After Bobby's disappearance, the town was transformed into a powder keg of suspicion. Neighbors who once greeted each other with nods now exchanged wary glances. Children were yanked indoors. Doors were bolted, windows nailed shut, and strangers were met with cold stares, or worse. The swamp itself seemed to breathe with menace. At night, its air was thick with humidity, carrying the croak of bullfrogs and the distant rustle of unseen creatures. Each sound set nerves on edge. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers paced their porches with rifles in hand. Rumors spread that gypsy bands were kidnapping children to sell them. Newspapers fanned the flames, publishing lurid headlines about wandering outsiders. Men riding in wagons, tinkers, and peddlers all became targets. Vigilantes chased strangers out of town, sometimes violently, convinced that somewhere in the chaos, Bobby was being hidden. But fear wasn't limited to outsiders. Whispers turned inward. Some accused the Dunbars themselves, muttering that Percy's wealth and arrogance might hide a darker truth. Others whispered that Bobby had wandered too far, that perhaps the family knew more than they admitted. A fisherman swore he saw a man leading a child away from the lake. The description was vague: a tall man, a hat pulled low, a boy trailing behind. Was it Bobby, or the imagination of a town drunk on hysteria? The rumors spread like wildfire, feeding on themselves. Every sighting, every vague report, every nervous whisper became evidence. The truth was buried under a mountain of speculation. Was Bobby Dunbar swallowed by the swamp, or stolen into the shadows of human cruelty? The frenzy gripped not just Opelousas but the entire South. Letters poured in from neighboring states, people claiming to have seen Bobby, offering tips, demanding action. The story became a regional obsession, a tragedy that people twisted into cautionary tales. Children were told not to stray from home. Families whispered of curses and omens. And then one letter arrived with a claim unlike the rest: a child alive, wandering with a man across the Mississippi border. What's more terrifying than losing a child? Believing you might never know the truth. For Percy and Leslie Dunbar, the days after Bobby's disappearance were not measured in hours but in screams and silence. Leslie's voice cracked from calling his name until it bled into whispers. She pressed Bobby's tiny clothes against her face, inhaling the faint smell of soap and summer sweat, as if scent alone could anchor him back. Percy, on the other hand, became steel. He stormed through Opelousas demanding action, slamming fists on tables in the sheriff's office and offering rewards that bled his fortune. He could not, admit defeat. But grief eats differently at a mother than it does at a father. Leslie wept openly, her pain raw and visible. Percy buried his inside, wearing his authority like armor. Yet cracks showed. Neighbors whispered they saw him packing at midnight, muttering Bobby's name, staring out at the swamp as if daring it to return his son. The Dunbars, wealth became both a weapon and a curse. Their money brought more searchers, more coverage, more pressure, but it also bred resentment. Townsfolk muttered that a poor man's missing child would never have stirred such frenzy. Some even accused the Dunbars of exaggerating the tragedy for attention, or worse, covering up an accident they couldn't admit. Leslie, crushed beneath whispers and stares, began to unravel. Her diary, later discovered, spoke of dreams where Bobby's voice echoed through the swamp, calling her mama from beneath the reeds. Each morning she woke to silence heavier than death. Percy, meanwhile, turned to control. He spoke to reporters as though Bobby was alive, demanding they print headlines filled with hope rather than despair. His determination gave the community a rallying cry, but it also silenced doubts he himself secretly carried. Even the family disagreed on what really happened that day. Relatives argued whether Bobby had drowned, been snatched, or wandered into the woods. The lack of closure fractured them, grief turning into blame. Family dinners turned cold, voices rose, and the Dunbar name, once respected, began to taste of scandal. How far would a grieving family go to rewrite tragedy into hope? The Dunbars became symbols in newspapers across the South. To some, they were martyrs of cruel fate. To others, they were arrogant manipulators, bending the truth with their wealth. And in that duality lies the timeless pattern. Just as powerful dynasties like the Kennedys and Romanovs shaped public narratives, so too did the Dunbars. Months later, when a child surfaced in Mississippi, the Dunbars faced the most agonizing choice of all: claim him, or risk losing hope forever. Inside a sweltering Louisiana courtroom, one small boy held the power to destroy reputations, families, and truth itself. The courthouse in Opelousas was suffocating that summer of 1913. Ceiling fans creaked overhead, pushing stale, humid air across rows of sweating spectators. Reporters packed the benches, pencils scratching furiously, their ink ready to crown a victor before the trial even began. At the center sat the child, silent, fidgeting, eyes darting between strangers who each claimed him as their own. This was not just a custody battle. It was a trial of identity itself. On one side, the Dunbars, polished, respectable, supported by wealth and community standing. On the other, Julia Anderson, a poor mill worker, barefoot in the eyes of society, already tarnished by rumors of immorality. The jury wasn't only listening to evidence, they were breathing in bias. The courtroom smelled of sweat, tobacco smoke, and desperation, a cocktail of human fear so thick it clung to the walls. Testimony after testimony painted conflicting pictures. Some swore the boy was Bobby, citing a mole on his foot. Others insisted he was Julia's son, Bruce, describing his mannerisms, his accent, his small habits only a mother would know. Even the child's memory betrayed him. When asked, he recognized some members of the Dunbar family, but not all. At times, he responded to Julia with familiarity, other times with indifference. His silence became a riddle the court could not solve. How do you prove who someone is when identity itself is on trial? The judge, worn thin by the circus of testimony, leaned heavily on the weight of public sentiment. and sentiment was stacked against Julia Anderson. She was branded not just as poor, but as unfit. Her character was dissected as though morality could determine motherhood. The decision wasn't made by facts, it was made by fear. Fear that a respectable family could lose their heir. Fear that chaos might reign if poverty triumphed over wealth. When the verdict came, it landed like a cannon blast. The boy would remain with Percy and Leslie Dunbar. The courtroom erupted, some with applause, others with outrage. Julia Anderson left in tears, her cries drowned by the roar of victory claimed by the Dunbars. But outside, the swamps whispered another truth. Locals still doubted, reporters still wondered, and even some jurors admitted privately they weren't certain. They had judged a story, not a child. It was a moment that mirrored modern scandals, where powerful families in politics or business bend the narrative, forcing the world to accept their version of reality. The gavel fell, the boy was declared Bobby Dunbar, but certainty never returned. In fact, the verdict only deepened the mystery, because from that day on, the boy carried two lives inside one body. But one secret was still waiting. The boy returned home as Bobby Dunbar, but whispers followed him like a shadow he could never escape. When Percy and Leslie Dunbar carried the boy back to Opelousas, Louisiana, the town celebrated like a war hero had returned. Church bells rang. Neighbors gathered in the humid dusk, clapping, shouting, weeping with relief. Leslie cradled him as though the world had been set right again. But beneath the cheers there was a tension, an unease, like the faint smell of smoke after a fire that never fully went out. The boy did not fit perfectly into his old life. Inside the Dunbar home he slept restlessly. He startled at unfamiliar sounds. At times he seemed unsure of the house's rooms, the family dog, even his siblings. Leslie insisted it was the trauma of abduction, that any child would behave strangely after such an ordeal. But some neighbors whispered otherwise. "That's not Bobby," they muttered. "That's someone else's child." Every outing into town was heavy with eyes. The child's movements, gestures, and words were studied with suspicion. Did he smile like Bobby once did? Did he remember old songs? The question of his identity lingered like a disease no doctor could cure. Even within the family, doubt sometimes cracked the surface. Privately, relatives admitted things felt off. His mannerisms, his speech, his reactions to favorite toys, details that didn't quite align with the Bobby they remembered. Yet none dared challenge the official verdict. To do so would unravel not only their relief, but their honor. What happens when a lie becomes so big, so public, that it's safer to live with it than to ever seek the truth? The Dunbars leaned into their new life, presenting their son as Bobby without hesitation. Photographs showed a smiling family, restored. But the smiles were armor, and the silence underneath was louder than any denial. The child grew into Bobby Dunbar, going to school, learning trades, building a life. Yet the whispers chased him. A strange boy in town, a man who never seemed entirely sure of the face in the mirror. The truth was buried but never dead. Generations later, it would claw its way back, demanding to be heard through modern science. But for now, the masquerade held firm, built on faith, fear, and the desperate human need to believe that order had been restored. The atmosphere mirrored scandals we see today: corporations, governments, even dynasties propping up a false narrative because the cost of truth is too high. The Bobby Dunbar case was no longer just about one boy. It had become about the terrifying power of collective denial. The boy lived as Bobby, but deep down, a ghost named Bruce still walked beside him. and decades later, DNA would prove the whispers had been right all along. But one secret was still waiting. While the Dunbars celebrated their victory, Julia Anderson walked away branded a liar, stripped of her son, and buried alive in shame. History often remembers the winners, not the wounded. For Julia Anderson, the courtroom verdict was more than a loss. It was a public execution of her dignity. Reporters described her as immoral, whispering of children born out of wedlock. They mocked her poverty, her lack of fine clothing, her accent that betrayed her working-class roots. To them, she wasn't a grieving mother. She was a spectacle, an object of scorn. Julia Anderson was not the villain. She was the silenced victim. She returned to North Carolina alone, the empty ache of her missing son haunting every corner of her life. The mill where she worked smelled of oil and hot iron, a daily reminder of her struggle to survive. She labored long shifts, her hands blistered, her back aching, while whispers followed her. That's the woman who lost her child in court. But Julia never stopped insisting the truth. To friends, neighbors, and anyone who would listen, she declared, "That was my Bruce." Her voice, though small against the roar of the press, refused to vanish. Years later, when the boy, living as Bobby Dunbar, grew into a man, Julia's surviving children claimed they recognized him instantly as their brother. But by then, society had moved on, content with the official version of events. How many lives are shattered when the powerful choose a truth that benefits them, and silence those who cannot fight back? Julia's life mirrored countless scandals, both past and present, where working-class voices are crushed under the weight of wealth and influence. Just as modern corporations bury whistleblowers, Julia was buried beneath the Dunbar's reputation, her story erased until history seemed to forget her altogether. Yet Julia's tragedy lingered, like a splinter beneath the skin of the narrative. For every smiling photograph of Bobby Dunbar, there was the ghost of Julia, mourning a child stolen not by a swamp, but by society itself. Her truth, dismissed for decades, would one day be resurrected, not by courts or newspapers, but by the blood itself. DNA, the silent witness, would finally speak the words Julia never stopped saying. "That boy was mine." But Julia never lived to see her vindication. She carried her grief to the grave, while the world went on believing the Dunbar's version of the story. Only generations later would her voice rise from history's shadows to demand justice. But one secret was still waiting. He lived his life as Bobby Dunbar, but inside him, another boy's ghost never stopped whispering. The boy, once torn between two families, grew into a man. To the world, he was Bobby Dunbar, a husband, a father, a hardworking mechanic. Photographs show him with a steady gaze, a man's strength in his hands, a family of his own built on the foundation of the name he carried. Yet beneath that name lurked a silence so deep it was almost unbearable. Bobby himself sometimes questioned who he really was. In private moments, he was known to ask his children strange questions. "Do you think I look like a Dunbar? Do you think I belong here?" His daughter, years later, admitted he carried a quiet heaviness, as though he never fully trusted the life he lived. The atmosphere around him was ordinary on the surface: oil-stained overalls, the metallic tang of machinery, the buzz of small-town chatter. But behind closed doors there was tension. Whispers of the past followed him like shadows slipping under the door. Some family members suspected the truth, but chose silence. To admit doubt would not only unravel his life, but humiliate the Dunbars, exposing them as either deceivers or victims of self-deception. Silence became their shield, denial their inheritance. How long can a family live with a lie before it begins to poison every generation that follows? Bobby raised children of his own, passing down stories of the swamp rescue, the heroic return, the courtroom victory. These tales became family lore, told and retold like gospel. But each retelling was a mask, a ritual to keep the doubt buried. The mask slipped in subtle ways. At times, Bobby avoided family conversations about his childhood. He changed the subject when asked about memories. He seemed almost detached, like a man wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. His life, in many ways, mirrored the tragedies of modern dynasties, where heirs live under names and legacies that may not truly belong to them. Just as powerful families today silence scandal to preserve an image, Bobby's life was a living monument to the cost of denial. He lived, he worked, he raised his children, but he never escaped the whisper. Was he really Bobby Dunbar? Decades later, that whisper would roar back with the force of science, shattering the silence his family fought so hard to preserve. But one secret was still waiting. The lie didn't die with Bobby, it multiplied, infecting his children, grandchildren, and every generation that carried his name. When Bobby Dunbar grew older and passed on, his children inherited more than his possessions. They inherited a story told so many times it had hardened into family legend. The swamp rescue, the courtroom drama, the triumphant return. Photographs hung on the walls, yellowing with age, showing Bobby as the boy who had survived the nightmare. But under the glass frames, the whispers never stopped. The Dunbar family was split between believers and doubters. Some clung to the official narrative. To them, questioning it felt like treason against their parents, their grandparents, their entire lineage. Others felt a gnawing unease, a quiet suspicion passed down like a curse. In late-night conversations, certain relatives admitted they weren't convinced. Something was always off, one granddaughter would later confess. The house of memory smelled of old wood, dust, and secrets. Generations living among heirlooms that told one story while their blood quietly murmured another. Every family reunion carried an invisible weight. The name Dunbar itself felt like a costume that didn't quite fit. The truth came back to haunt through Julia Anderson's descendants. They too passed down their own family story of a boy named Bruce, stolen by wealth and prejudice. Their tale was not framed on walls but whispered with grief, a legacy of loss rather than triumph. Two families, two competing myths, circling each other across decades like ghosts chained together. What happens when history writes two truths, and bloodlines are forced to live inside both? As years turned into decades, the weight of doubt pressed harder. Children and grandchildren of Bobby grew up with a contradiction, honoring a name they carried while wondering if that name was never theirs to begin with. Identity, once questioned, became a generational wound. By the late 20th century, the whispers grew too loud to ignore. In the age of science, DNA testing emerged as a new kind of judge, cold, impartial, unshaken by money or class. The descendants of both families began to circle around one terrifying possibility, that everything they believed, everything they had inherited, might collapse under the weight of genetic truth. This echoed the scandals of modern dynasties, families in politics or business who build empires on shaky foundations, only to see them shattered by documents, recordings, or leaks that expose the fault lines beneath. For the Dunbars, the ghost of Bruce Anderson had never been buried. He had lived inside their blood, their memories, their very name. And soon, science would drag him back into the light. But one secret was still waiting. For nearly a century, the Bobby Dunbar story was untouchable, until science sharpened its blade and cut through the legend. By the late 20th century, the world had changed. Newspapers no longer controlled every truth, and families no longer lived only within the walls of oral history. DNA testing, once the stuff of science fiction, emerged as the new courtroom, the new judge, jury, and executioner. Unlike human memory, DNA did not bend to bias, poverty, or wealth. It was the blood itself, finally allowed to speak. The Dunbar family could no longer silence the whispers. For generations, relatives had argued behind closed doors, some convinced, others haunted by doubt. But by the 1990s, the family decided to confront the ghost once and for all. It was not just curiosity. It was necessity. They needed to know if the man they had buried as Bobby Dunbar had truly been theirs or Julia Anderson's stolen son. The preparation felt almost ceremonial. Swabs, vials, sterile gloves. The room buzzed with nervous tension, the faint smell of antiseptic sharp in the air, like a hospital ward, about to deliver either salvation or death. Descendants lined up, carrying not only their own identities but the weight of generations past. DNA testing threatened to destroy one family's entire legacy. For the Dunbars, the risk was immense. If science declared the boy was not theirs, it meant their entire history, photographs, stories, even their name, was built on a lie. For Julia Anderson's descendants, it was a chance at redemption, proof that she had never lied, that her son had been taken from her by a system stacked against the poor. What happens when science collides with legend? When facts refuse to bow to the myths we've worshipped for generations? The test results came back like a thunderclap. The boy raised as Bobby Dunbar was not a Dunbar at all. DNA proved he was Bruce Anderson, Julia's lost son. Nearly 90 years of history collapsed in an instant. The Dunbars' triumph became tragedy. Julia's shame became vindication. The revelation did not heal, it divided. Some family members clung to the story they had been told, unwilling to accept science's verdict. Others felt shattered, betrayed by the very name they had carried all their lives. The truth was undeniable, yet unbearable. It was a moment that echoed modern scandals, when long-buried secrets, emails, recordings, DNA, or leaks, tear apart the powerful and expose the rot beneath legacies built on lies. The science had spoken, but the wounds did not close. For one family, the truth meant freedom. For the other, it meant living in the ruins of a stolen identity. But one secret was still waiting. Truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes, it detonates everything you thought was real. The DNA test was supposed to end the mystery. Instead, it ripped open wounds that had festered for nearly a century. The Bobby Dunbar story, once a source of family pride, now stood exposed as a monument to theft and injustice. But what happens when the truth finally comes, and it destroys the very foundation of who you are? The Dunbar descendants were shaken to their core. For generations, they had carried the name with pride, telling their children about the heroic rescue of little Bobby from the swamps of Louisiana. They had believed in the strength of their legacy. But now, with one lab report, it all turned to dust. For the Anderson family, the revelation was vindication, but also agony. Julia Anderson had gone to her grave branded a liar, a woman unfit to raise her child. The DNA results proved her right, but too late to restore her dignity, too late for her son to know his true identity. Vindication came with bitterness, like rain falling on a grave. Around kitchen tables and in living rooms, the two families grappled with the fallout. Some Dunbars refused to accept the DNA. Science can make mistakes, they whispered, clinging to the legend rather than facing betrayal. Others broke down in tears, feeling as if their entire childhood had been stolen, replaced by a story that wasn't theirs. The revelation divided families instead of uniting them. Cousins turned on cousins. Old resentments flared. For some, the truth was liberation. For others, it was exile. If your family's name, history, and very bloodline turned out to be a lie, who would you be? The Anderson descendants, meanwhile, were left to wrestle with rage. Their ancestor had been poor, powerless, and dismissed. Now they knew the cost of that injustice. A stolen child, a mother's heartbreak, a century of silence. Yes, they had been vindicated, but at what price? The emotional fallout was more than personal, it was generational trauma. It revealed how institutions, the courts, the press, the wealthy, had destroyed one woman's truth to protect another family's comfort. And now, 100 years later, the echoes of that injustice still poison the living. The case became a mirror for society itself. How many other truths do we accept because they're convenient, because they preserve the comfort of the powerful? And how many lies are buried in the names we carry, the stories we inherit, the histories we teach? The Bobby Dunbar case had started with a missing child. But by the end, it revealed something far darker, the fragility of identity itself. Because if a name, a bloodline, even an entire family can be stolen, what else in history is a lie waiting to be exposed? What if your family tree was built on a lie? The Bobby Dunbar mystery is not just about one missing child in 1912. It's about something larger, something haunting that echoes through dynasties, empires, and even modern politics. When the Dunbars fought to keep Bobby as their own, they weren't just saving a child. They were rewriting history in their favor. And that is a power as old as civilization itself. In Louisiana, their wealth and social standing insulated them. The newspapers, the courts, even the whispers in church pews, all bent toward the Dunbars' version of truth. Julia Anderson's cries, by contrast, were silenced under the weight of poverty and prejudice. The case wasn't about identity, it was about power. Whoever controlled the child controlled the narrative, and whoever controlled the narrative controlled the legacy. Think of the great families throughout history. The Tudors rewriting English succession with blood and betrayal, the Romanovs burying scandals behind palaces, the Kennedys silencing whispers through influence. The Dunbars may have been a small-town Louisiana family, but their story follows the same dark blueprint. Sacrifice the truth to preserve the dynasty. How many of the stories we believe about our families, our leaders, even our nations, are carefully curated lies? The Dunbars didn't just steal a child, they stole a bloodline. That theft reshaped generations. Every grandchild and great-grandchild who believed they were Dunbars carried not just a false name, but the weight of a stolen history. That's more than family fraud. It's identity theft on a generational scale. Viscerally, imagine the chilling silence of a courthouse in 1913. The wooden benches creaked. The stale air carried the smell of sweat and ink. Julia Anderson stood trembling as men in suits dissected her motherhood. Her voice cracked as she swore the child was hers, but the gavel's strike erased her truth. That sound, wood on wood, didn't just end a trial, it rewrote history. And here's the chilling modern echo. Today's political dynasties still manipulate narratives. From disputed elections to buried scandals, the powerful shaped truth as a weapon. The Dunbar case is not just a tragedy, it's a blueprint for how power silences the powerless. History doesn't remember what's true, it remembers what's told. And so, the Bobby Dunbar story leaves us with a haunting revelation. Truth is fragile, identity can be stolen, and entire legacies can be manufactured. But one secret was still waiting, hidden in the photographs, locked in the memories of a boy who may never have been Bobby Dunbar at all. What if the proof of Bobby's true identity has been staring at us for over a century, in plain sight? Long before DNA cracked open the case, there was another trail of evidence: photographs. Grainy, sepia-toned portraits taken in the early 1900s, each freezing time with eerie permanence. The Dunbars proudly displayed pictures of the boy they claimed was Bobby, while the Andersons clutched images of little Bruce. To the naked eye, they looked almost identical. But beneath the shadows of the photographs, secrets lurked. Newspapers of the era printed side-by-side comparisons. Crowds squinted, mothers argued, fathers swore one way or another. The child's eyes, they said, the curve of his lips. Entire communities debated identity like it was a parlor game. But the photographs may have revealed the truth all along. Close analysis by modern historians has suggested that the rescued Bobby bore a stronger resemblance to Julia Anderson's other children than to the Dunbars. In other words, the camera may have exposed the lie a century before science did. Imagine holding one of those brittle photographs today, the dry, powdery smell of aging paper, the cool surface of glossy prints that have survived wars and storms. Looking into the boy's face feels like looking into a mirror that lies back to you. His stare seems to ask, "Who am I really?" Can a photograph capture truth, or does it simply reflect the story we want to believe? Even in 1913, people noticed inconsistencies. Some swore the boy had scars Bobby never had. Others pointed out subtle differences in ear shape or the set of his jaw. But such voices were drowned out by the tide of the Dunbar's influence. The photographs weren't neutral, they became weapons. In court, images of the boy with the Dunbars were paraded as proof of belonging. Julia Anderson's photographs, by contrast, were dismissed as unreliable, as if the faces of her children couldn't testify for themselves. And here, the unsettling part. This wasn't just about identity, it was about perception. Photographs can lie. They can be framed, staged, or interpreted in ways that serve power. Just like today, when images are manipulated, cropped, or spread online, changing reputations with a single viral post. The Bobby Dunbar case is a reminder that images are never passive. They are tools of narrative warfare. The boy's face became the battlefield. And so the photographs endure, dusty, yellowed, silent witnesses to a century-old theft. But if the images held the truth all along, why did no one act? Because one final piece of evidence, long overlooked, was still waiting in the shadows, ready to reveal what photographs never could. What if the people who knew the truth were silenced, and their voices buried for over a century? The Bobby Dunbar case wasn't decided by DNA or photographs in 1912. It was decided by witnesses. Ordinary townsfolk, fishermen, neighbors, even children. Their testimonies were the fragile threads upon which truth hung. But like fragile threads, they snapped under the weight of influence, fear, and time. When the boy was first found near Sway's Lake, locals insisted he was Bobby. They described him as shy, confused, and calling himself Bruce. Several witnesses swore he clung to Julia Anderson when she appeared, not to the Dunbars. Their words should have been enough. But in the echoing walls of the courtroom, their voices faded. Many witnesses changed their stories. Under pressure, intimidation, or the slow grind of doubt, some began to second-guess what they saw. By the time the trial reached its climax, the chorus of voices had been drowned out by the Dunbars' wealth and reputation. Imagine the scene. The courthouse heavy with heat, the stale smell of tobacco and sweat, the buzz of flies circling above wooden benches. A fisherman shifts uneasily, his rough hands twisting a hat, as lawyers glare at him from the front. He stammers, changes a detail, shrinks under their gaze. Truth wilts under intimidation. If you saw the truth, but power demanded silence, would you speak or would you break? Key testimonies vanished from the record. Letters, statements, and reports that could have supported Julia Anderson's claim were never preserved. Some say they were lost to poor documentation. Others whisper they were deliberately destroyed. A mother's defense, erased as if it had never existed. The forgotten witnesses are more than historical footnotes. They represent the fragility of justice itself. How often have voices of the poor, the powerless, the marginalized been stripped from history books? From enslaved people whose testimonies were ignored to whistleblowers silenced by corporations, the Dunbar case is a chilling reflection of how truth dies in silence. History is not what happened, it's what was allowed to be heard. And just as social media today amplifies some voices while burying others, so too did the press of 1912. Julia was painted as immoral, unreliable, even dangerous. Her witnesses inherited the same stigma, their words dismissed as noise against the respectable Dunbars. Yet scattered through archives, whispers remain. Fragments of letters, forgotten newspaper clippings, and half-remembered accounts that, when pieced together, form a chilling picture. Because if the voices of the forgotten had been heard, the boy we call Bobby Dunbar might never have gone home with the Dunbars at all. She entered the courtroom to fight for her son, but walked out condemned by society itself. The year was 1913. Julia Anderson, a poor woman from North Carolina, stood before a jury not just to prove she was the boy's mother, but to defend her very character. This wasn't merely a custody case. It was a trial of morality, class, and reputation, and Julia was about to lose everything. From the moment she took the stand, the air was poisoned against her. The courtroom smelled of tobacco smoke and damp wood, the benches packed with curious townsfolk, their whispers like knives. Julia, trembling in a plain dress, faced not only the lawyers of the Dunbars but the silent judgment of an entire society. The jury wasn't judging the boy, they were judging Julia. Newspapers branded her as immoral for bearing children out of wedlock. Her poverty was twisted into evidence of unfitness. Every detail of her private life became ammunition against her. She was painted not as a grieving mother, but as a reckless woman who didn't deserve her own child. What chance does truth have when morality is weaponized against the powerless? Witness after witness contradicted her. Some claimed the boy didn't recognize her. Others, who once said he clung to her, suddenly shifted their testimony. Julia fought tears, swearing through a breaking voice that he was hers, but each word she spoke seemed only to dig her grave deeper. Julia's voice was erased before she even spoke. Reporters mocked her, calling her testimony confused, unreliable, desperate. The jury never saw her as a mother. They saw her as a scandal. Imagine her despair. Her hands clutching the rough wood of the witness stand, her breath trembling, the sound of men's laughter echoing as she tried to speak. Every time she looked toward the boy, he seemed lost, dazed, unable, or unwilling, to choose her over the family with wealth and power. The court didn't just steal Julia's child, it stole her dignity. She walked out of the courthouse defeated, branded for life as a liar. The Dunbars left triumphant with Bobby in their arms, celebrated as the family who overcame tragedy. The verdict was more than a legal decision. It was a public execution of character. Julia Anderson was cast as an outcast, her truth discarded, her motherhood erased. And here's the chilling parallel. How many mothers throughout history have lost their children not to kidnappers, but to systems designed to strip the powerless of their voice? From orphan trains to modern custody battles tilted by wealth, Julia's case was a cruel reminder that the courtroom doesn't always serve justice. It often serves power. But even as Julia Anderson was broken, the boy himself remained a mystery. His silence in court, his confusion, his dazed stares, what did he know? Because the child at the center of it all carried a secret no one in that courtroom was ready to face. Sometimes the loudest truth is hidden in silence. Throughout the Bobby Dunbar case, one voice remained eerily absent, the boy. Reporters captured every word from the Dunbars, every accusation from Julia Anderson, every ruling from the courts. But the child at the center of the storm rarely spoke, and when he did, his words only deepened the mystery. At first he called himself Bruce. Witnesses swore to it. Yet under the Dunbar's care, he gradually stopped using the name. By the time the trial came, he seemed withdrawn, confused, and compliant. He didn't leap into Julia's arms, but neither did he resist her touch. His silence was unnerving, like a puzzle missing its most vital piece. The boy may have known more than anyone realized. Children process trauma differently. Experts today argue that he may have been suffering from shock, disassociation, or even coercion. Imagine a 6-year-old torn between two identities, his biological mother insisting one truth, and a wealthy family demanding another. Silence may have been his only refuge. Was his silence innocence, or the survival instinct of a child forced to choose? Visually, it's haunting to imagine. A small boy, eyes wide but vacant, sitting on a hard wooden bench while strangers argued over his soul. The stale courtroom air pressed heavy, the clack of boots echoing off the floorboards. His little hands fidgeted with his shirt hem. When asked to identify his mother, he looked down, lips sealed. Silence can be shaped. The Dunbars rewarded his compliance, while Julia's desperation frightened him. Over time, the boy adapted, leaning toward the family who provided security, even if it meant burying the memory of his real identity. In psychological terms, this is called survival attachment. A child clings to whoever offers protection, even if it erases the truth. The press interpreted his silence as proof against Julia, but modern psychology tells a different story. The boy may have been trapped in a trauma bond, too young to articulate his pain, too afraid to speak. Silence wasn't absence, it was resistance. His silence became the weapon that decided his fate. The court interpreted it as rejection of Julia and acceptance of the Dunbars. A child's quiet confusion was twisted into a legal verdict that would define generations. And here lies the tragedy. The boy's silence didn't just cost Julia her son. It reshaped two families, altered history, and buried the truth for a century. But silence cannot last forever. Clues remained, whispers in the photographs, scars on the boy's body, and memories he could never fully erase. Because even in silence, the body remembers. And Bobby Dunbar's body carried secrets no one wanted to confront. When truth hides in silence, the body speaks louder than words. For all the debates, all the testimony, and all the court's rulings, one piece of evidence sat in plain sight, etched into the child's skin. Scars, marks, clues that could have told the world whether this boy was truly Bobby Dunbar or Bruce Anderson. Witnesses described a scar on the boy's left foot, supposedly matching one Bobby had sustained before his disappearance. Others swore the child bore moles and blemishes in the exact places Julia Anderson remembered on her son. Yet strangely, the records conflict. Some reports confirm the scars, others deny them. Even the official transcripts from the trial gloss over the details, as if no one wanted to lock the truth in ink. The scars weren't just evidence, they were battlegrounds. The Dunbars pointed to them as undeniable proof. Julia claimed they were different, belonging to her boy Bruce. And the press, they twisted the scars into a spectacle, turning the child's body into a courtroom exhibit. Imagine the scene. A crowded courthouse, men fanning themselves against the thick Louisiana heat, women whispering behind lace gloves, and at the center, a trembling boy with his shirt pulled aside, his small body scrutinized like a crime scene. Every scar, every mole became a weapon in the war for his identity. Were those scars truth, or manufactured memories projected onto a child? Modern psychology tells us memory is fragile, especially under stress. Parents grieving a missing child often rewrite details in their minds. Julia may have remembered Bruce's body as she wanted to, just as the Dunbars clung to every mark as Bobby's proof of life. In reality, the scars may have been ordinary, yet burdened with extraordinary meaning. But there's a darker theory. Some suggest that the boy's silence and scars weren't just coincidence. They hinted at a hidden past. Could he have endured injuries while wandering with William Walters, the man accused of abducting him? Or worse, had those scars been inflicted before, in the chaotic years of Julia's poverty, when survival often left its own brutal marks? The truth lies buried, but one fact remains chilling. The scars outlived the arguments. They stayed with the boy for life, reminders carved into flesh that whispered of another identity. And yet, there was something even more damning. Long after the case closed, the scars faded into family lore, but the photographs remained. Old, grainy images tucked away in archives, waiting for modern eyes to re-examine them. Because scars may fade, but photographs never forget, and they would one day reopen the mystery of Bobby Dunbar. A single photograph can outlive 1,000 lies. While memories fractured and scars faded, one form of evidence refused to die: photographs. The Dunbars posed proudly with their recovered son. Newspaper flashes immortalized his face. And the world believed it was Bobby Dunbar brought home. But decades later, those images would betray them. Grainy, sepia-toned, and fragile as dust, these photos were preserved in family albums and archives. They captured a boy staring into the camera with wide, unreadable eyes. Was he relieved? Was he terrified? Or was he silently pleading for someone, anyone, to see the truth? The photographs didn't just preserve a boy, they preserved the doubt. Modern historians and descendants began comparing those early photos of Bobby Dunbar with later images of Bruce Anderson's known relatives. And the resemblance, unsettling. His jawline, the curve of his nose, even the way his eyes carried that faraway stare, it all aligned more with Bruce's bloodline than the Dunbars. In the photographs, the boy's expression often looked out of place, almost staged. A child returning to his real parents would smile naturally, some argued. Yet here, his smile seemed painted on, stiff, as if coached into existence for the cameras. The atmosphere of those photos, polished, triumphant, masked a darker possibility that they were documenting a lie being sold to the public. Were these images proof of reunion, or propaganda sealing a false identity? Psychologically, photographs are dangerous. They freeze time, yet they also manipulate perception. The Dunbars' decision to parade their son before cameras wasn't just celebration, it was strategy. Every picture made the identity harder to question. The more the world saw Bobby restored, the less room there was for Julia Anderson's cries of injustice. But history wasn't finished with those photographs. In the late 20th century, relatives and researchers revisited them, magnifying details the world had overlooked. The boy's ears different, his gaze unsettlingly distant. Even his posture mirrored Bruce Anderson more than Bobby Dunbar. Photographs meant to silence the questions ended up reigniting them. Modern scandals echo this tactic. Families, dynasties, even corporations use imagery to cement their narratives. The Kennedy dynasty's Camelot photos, for example, painted perfection while hiding shadows. Just like the Dunbars, image became shield, weapon, and illusion. The photos alone couldn't overturn the verdict of 1912, but paired with something stronger, DNA, they would one day shatter the story wide open. Because while photographs preserve doubt, DNA preserves truth, and it was waiting like a time bomb. Sometimes the loudest evidence is what a child refuses to say. Throughout the entire Bobby Dunbar case, one figure remained eerily quiet, the boy himself. He was old enough to speak, old enough to answer simple questions, but when pressed about his name, his family, or his memories, he often fell silent. That silence became its own haunting mystery. Reporters noted how the child seemed hesitant, pausing before answering even the simplest of questions. His words were few, his tone flat, almost rehearsed. When asked directly if he was Bobby, sometimes he said yes, but often after a long pause or after being prompted by adults hovering nearby. Silence wasn't just absence, it was resistance. Some suspected the boy's hesitation was proof he was not Bobby Dunbar, but Bruce Anderson. Others suggested he was traumatized, too shaken by months of wandering with William Walters to recall his identity. Either way, his silence carved cracks into the Dunbar story. Imagine the atmosphere. A courtroom buzzing with whispers, children outside laughing in the Louisiana sun, but inside, one boy's voice barely above a whisper. His silence weighed heavier than thunder. Was this silence the confusion of trauma, or the defiance of a child forced into a false identity? Psychologists today understand what courts in 1912 did not. Trauma reshapes memory, even speech. Children under stress often retreat into silence, especially when placed under public scrutiny. If this boy was Bruce, ripped from Julia Anderson and pushed into a strange family, silence may have been his only rebellion. But there's another chilling theory. Some historians believe the boy learned quickly that silence was survival. Surrounded by strangers, pressured by the press, paraded before crowds, what could a child do but shut down? His muteness wasn't confusion, it was self-defense. Over time, silence hardened into identity. By the time he grew into adulthood, he rarely spoke about the case at all. His children knew him as a quiet man, a figure who carried secrets but never shared them. That lifelong silence echoed louder than any courtroom ruling. It suggested the truth was too painful or too dangerous to ever voice. And doesn't this sound familiar? From royal dynasties to political families, silence often guards the darkest secrets. The Romanovs hid the rumors of Anastasia. The Kennedys buried their scandals under stoic quiet. And the Dunbars, they built an empire of silence around a boy who never spoke his truth. The silence left a void, but voids don't last forever. When the boy's descendants began digging decades later, they unearthed something that would finally give him a voice. Because silence can be ignored for a lifetime, but DNA cannot be silenced forever. One test, one vial of blood, shattered a century-old family legacy. For nearly 90 years, the story of Bobby Dunbar was sealed shut. Generations of Dunbars grew up believing their patriarch had been the boy found near a Louisiana swamp in 1912. But in the year 2004, science cracked open the coffin of certainty. The Dunbar descendants agreed to what courts, reporters, and witnesses could never resolve: a DNA test. Bobby's son, Bob Jr., provided a sample. Then, researchers compared it to the genetic material of the Anderson family, the line of Julia Anderson, the woman who had never stopped claiming the boy was her son. The results were undeniable. There was no genetic link between the boy raised as Bobby Dunbar and the Dunbar family. None. The DNA proved the child was Bruce Anderson, Julia's lost boy. Think about it. Nearly a century of family identity, photographs, traditions, even graves, all built on a mistake, or perhaps a theft. The boy everyone celebrated as a returned son was never Bobby at all. If DNA shattered the Dunbar story, how many other family legacies are built on lies? The psychological weight of this discovery cannot be overstated. Imagine being told that your grandfather, the man whose life defined your family's history, was not who everyone believed him to be. His silence, his scars, his hesitation, it all clicked into place in an instant. But the DNA test didn't just solve the mystery, it opened a wound. For the Dunbars, it meant their lineage was forever altered. For the Andersons, it meant Julia had been right all along, yet she went to her grave branded a liar. The verdict of history was overturned in a single page of lab results. The atmosphere was electric, papers rustling in sterile labs, researchers whispering as numbers lined up to expose the truth, descendants weeping at the revelation. What once had been myth now stood as a scientific fact, cold, undeniable, merciless. And here lies the chilling parallel. Just as corporations and dynasties today collapse under leaked documents and genetic scandals, the Dunbars fell not by rumor, but by evidence that could not be argued. DNA was the ultimate whistleblower. Yet the DNA test raised one question that science alone could not answer. What happened to the real Bobby Dunbar? Because proving the boy was Bruce Anderson solved one mystery, but opened the darkest question of all. If the boy raised as Bobby wasn't him, then where did the real Bobby Dunbar go? This is the question that gnaws at history's bones. DNA closed one door but blew another wide open. If the child found near the Louisiana swamp was Bruce Anderson, Julia's son, then the real Bobby Dunbar, the boy who vanished on that hot August day in 1912, was never found. His trail ended at Swayze Lake, and that silence is more terrifying than any courtroom drama. At first, theories swirled. Some believed Bobby drowned in the swamp that day, his body consumed by alligators or sinking into the mud. Others whispered darker rumors that he was kidnapped, perhaps trafficked, and never returned. And then there's the most chilling theory of all: murder. Some speculated that Bobby might have died accidentally during the family's outing, and in their panic, the Dunbars covered it up, later finding Bruce to fill the void. The theory sounds outrageous until you remember how fiercely the Dunbars clung to the boy they were given, despite all doubts. Imagine the scene. The swamp buzzing with cicadas, the sickly sweet stench of rotting vegetation, the cries of searchers echoing across the murky water. A mother's scream, a father's frantic splashing, lanterns swinging in the humid night. Somewhere in that darkness, Bobby's fate was sealed. Was Bobby lost to nature's cruelty or to human hands? Psychologically, the disappearance cuts deeper than DNA results. Families often rewrite loss into stories of hope, and the Dunbars' miracle reunion may have been just that, a way to escape the unbearable truth that Bobby was gone forever. The body they never found became the ghost that haunted generations. And haunting it remains. No evidence of Bobby has ever surfaced, not a bone, not a shred of clothing. He simply vanished as if swallowed by history itself. That absence keeps the case alive because, unlike Julia Anderson, Bobby's mother never truly had closure. Modern parallels exist everywhere. Families of missing children, like the infamous cases of Madeleine McCann or Etten Patz, cling to photographs, birthdays, and rituals in the absence of answers. The Dunbars lived this same nightmare, but their solution rewrote history at another family's expense. And so the story of Bobby Dunbar does not end with DNA, but with absence. A boy erased, a mother deceived, a mystery that no science has yet solved. Because sometimes the deadliest mystery is not who was found, but who never came home. What happens to a family built on a lie they never chose? For the Dunbars, the Bobby case did not end in 1912. It became their foundation. They raised the boy as their own. He grew into a man, married, had children, and passed down the name Dunbar with pride. Generations grew up celebrating a miracle reunion that, as DNA would prove decades later, had never been real. Inside the family, the story was gospel. Around dinner tables, children heard how their grandfather had been lost and found again, a tale of survival against impossible odds. Photographs were passed down like relics, proof of a legacy that gave the Dunbars a sense of destiny. But destiny built on falsehood corrodes in silence. Behind closed doors, the boy who grew up as Bobby rarely spoke of his childhood ordeal. His silence wasn't just personal, it became cultural, woven into the Dunbar legacy. No one dared press too hard, because questioning the story meant risking the entire family identity. Imagine the weight of it. Holiday gatherings with laughter and songs, yet underneath, the quiet hum of suspicion. Did anyone truly believe? Did anyone secretly wonder why their patriarch's eyes always darkened at the mention of 1912? How do you live your whole life as the heir of a lie? When the truth broke in 2004, the family was split. Some embraced it, acknowledging the science and admitting the boy they loved was Bruce Anderson. Others resisted, clinging to the legend as if truth itself were betrayal. Because to them, Bobby Dunbar wasn't just a child, it was their origin story. And that's the cruelest legacy of all. The Anderson family lost Bruce for a lifetime, and the Dunbars lost Bobby forever. Both families were fractured by a single substitution, left with scars that bled across generations. The psychological toll is immense. Children inherit not only DNA but narrative. To discover that your grandfather wasn't who the world believed shatters more than identity. It fractures belonging. The Dunbars were left adrift, caught between love for the man they knew and the truth science forced upon them. And this is not unique. Dynasties across history, royals, politicians, tycoons, have built empires on lies. The Tudors rewrote succession, the Kennedys buried scandals, the Romanovs clung to myth. The Dunbars, though ordinary, carried the same burden, a family bound to a secret. But as the Dunbars struggled with their fractured legacy, the Andersons carried a wound of their own, the theft of Bruce and Julia's humiliation. Their story, the story of loss, truth denied and vindication delayed, would demand its own telling. Because the Dunbars inherited a lie, but the Andersons inherited the silence of a stolen child. Deep inside the coroner's archives of St. Mary Parish, buried beneath decades of dust, researchers stumbled upon a chilling discovery, an old ledger bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. At first glance, it seemed like a routine inventory of medical supplies. But upon closer inspection, it revealed something far more sinister, an accounting of poisons: arsenic, strychnine, laudanum. Each substance meticulously listed, alongside dates and initials that eerily matched the deaths of prominent widows and young brides in the community. The handwriting was elegant, almost feminine, with looping curves and flourishes. Some investigators believed it belonged to a nurse who had worked at the parish hospital in the late 1880s, a woman rumored to have close ties to both the Brennan clan and the powerful Duval family. Others suspected it was the work of a local apothecary, a quiet man who had made his fortune selling medicinals to those who knew exactly how to use them. Whoever had kept this ledger wasn't just recording, they were tracking. Death wasn't random. It was orchestrated, precise, calculated like entries in a business ledger. One entry stood out above all: E.J., 1890, completed. Beneath it, the word inheritance was scrawled, underlined twice. That year, records showed a widow named Elise Johnson had died suddenly after her wealthy husband passed. Her estate had been bitterly contested, with portions absorbed by a law firm connected to the Duvals. The ledger transformed Elise's death from tragic coincidence into deliberate conspiracy. As whispers of the ledger spread, families in the parish began digging into their own histories. Long-forgotten stories resurfaced, of brides who fainted days after weddings, of children who wasted away after drinking tonics prescribed by family doctors, of widows who died before their wills were ever finalized. The ledger acted as a key, connecting these tragedies like dots on a map, and each dot pointed toward a single terrifying conclusion: the community itself had been complicit. The wealthy profited, the doctors covered it, and the poisoners executed it with near-perfect silence. But silence doesn't last forever. By the time journalists got hold of the ledger in the early 1900s, it had already vanished, much like the Swayze Lake victim. Some claimed the Duval family bought it and burned it. Others believed it was hidden in the walls of the old parish courthouse, sealed away with other inconvenient truths. What remained were only fragments, photocopied pages smuggled by a clerk who feared the story would be erased entirely. Those fragments were enough. They confirmed what survivors and descendants had long suspected. The Brennan model of marriage and murder wasn't just a dark rumor. It was a well-oiled system, documented in ink and measured in lives cut short. The ledger gave the conspiracy its most terrifying proof. Not that poison was used, but that poison had been accounted for. The boy who returned home might not have been Bobby Dunbar at all. The year was 1913, and the Dunbar family's nightmare seemed to have ended. After 8 agonizing months of searching, they brought home the child believed to be Bobby. The town of Opelousas erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, and neighbors gathered in the sweltering Louisiana air to welcome back the boy they thought was theirs. But beneath the cheers, the atmosphere carried a strange unease, like a hot wind that refuses to settle before a storm. At first glance, Bobby seemed healthy if a little thin from the ordeal. His mother clung to him, whispering prayers of relief, while reporters scribbled furiously, already framing the story as a miracle. Yet as the dust settled, tiny cracks began to appear in the tale. Bobby didn't recognize his own dog. The boy pulled back when the Dunbars presented him with the family's loyal hound, a pet who had once never left his side. Locals exchanged glances, whispers slicing through the warm night like the sharp snap of a match. Still, the Dunbars insisted. He was just traumatized, they explained, his memory fractured by months of wandering. But the explanations grew harder to defend when even extended family members began noticing peculiar differences, subtle, unsettling changes in his voice, his gestures, even the way he pronounced certain words. Another woman came forward, claiming the boy was hers. Julia Anderson, a struggling mill worker from North Carolina, traveled south to declare that the child was not Bobby Dunbar but her own son, Bruce. She spoke with quiet certainty, recalling details about the boy's birthmarks and habits that no stranger could have invented. Was this truly Bobby, or had the Dunbars, desperate to end their suffering, claimed another woman's child? The courtroom drama that followed split the community. On one side were the Dunbars, clinging to their reputation and authority, backed by the full weight of their standing in Opelousas. On the other was Julia Anderson, poor and vulnerable, branded a liar by many who refused to believe that a respectable family could ever commit such a theft. The boy at the center of it all seemed trapped in a haze of confusion. At times, he clung to the Dunbars. At others, he responded to Julia as if she were his true mother. His silence became its own haunting testimony, more powerful than any words. The court sided with the Dunbars. Julia's pleas were dismissed, and the boy was legally declared Bobby Dunbar. The ruling brought a wave of applause from the crowd, but beneath it lingered the bitter stench of injustice, like the acrid smoke of a candle snuffed too soon. Modern parallels are chilling. Powerful families today often wield influence to silence rivals, whether in corporate boardrooms or political dynasties. The Dunbars' victory raised the same question we ask of modern scandals: was truth sacrificed for the sake of reputation? But if this was Bobby Dunbar, then where was the real boy? The boy they called Bobby Dunbar grew older, but the shadows of doubt never aged a day. By the 1920s, life in Opelousas had returned to a rhythm, but beneath the town's polite smiles and Sunday sermons, the whispers remained. People noticed little things about Bobby, things that didn't fit. His speech carried a twang that didn't sound Louisiana-born. His memories of his supposed childhood were hazy at best, like someone trying to recall a dream that never truly belonged to them. The boy himself seemed restless, unsettled, as if he too sensed the fracture in his identity. In moments of solitude, he'd wander the back fields, staring at the horizon with a strange distance in his eyes, as though searching for something he couldn't name. Family members privately admitted doubts. Relatives confessed, though never in public, that they weren't always certain this child was their Bobby. One aunt swore his eyes were a different shade. An uncle noted his mannerisms were unfamiliar. Yet no one dared speak too loudly. To question Bobby's identity was to reopen the wound the Dunbars had so proudly stitched shut. The fear of disgrace kept the secret buried, But buried secrets have a way of poisoning the soil above. Rumors spread like wildfire in small towns. Some swore Bobby was indeed Bruce Anderson, Julia's child, stolen under the cloak of desperation and sanctioned by law. Julia Anderson never stopped claiming him. Though branded a liar, Julia never wavered. She told friends and neighbors that her boy had been stolen, that she had been powerless against the wealth and status of the Dunbars. Even decades later, her descendants carried the bitterness of her humiliation, a pain that stretched across generations like a scar that never healed. If the boy was truly Bruce, how could an entire justice system have betrayed a mother so completely? The parallels to modern scandals are chilling. From corporate whistleblowers silenced by billion-dollar companies to families overshadowed by political dynasties, the Dunbar case reflects a timeless pattern. When power collides with truth, truth often loses. By adulthood, Bobby married, raised children, and tried to live a normal life. He avoided questions about his disappearance, brushing off curiosity with a haunted edge in his tone. His silence became his shield, but those who knew him best said the silence itself spoke volumes. The truth didn't die with him. Long after Bobby's death in 1966, his children inherited both his name and the gnawing uncertainty of his identity. It was a puzzle passed like a cursed heirloom, whispering through time, waiting for someone brave enough to face it. And decades later, science would unearth an answer that no court ever dared to. Nearly a century later, the truth of Bobby Dunbar's disappearance was ripped open by a single drop of blood. By the 1990s, the mystery of Bobby Dunbar had become a legend whispered in Louisiana and beyond. Generations had grown up with the story of the boy lost in the swamp, found by determined parents and restored to his family. But for Bobby's descendants, the tale wasn't folklore, it was a gnawing wound. His granddaughter, Margaret Dunbar Cutright, refused to let the whispers remain unanswered. Margaret pressed for clarity, determined to separate fact from fiction. With technology her ancestors could never have imagined, she sought the ultimate arbiter, DNA. The process was quiet, clinical, yet terrifying. A cotton swab rubbed against the inside of a cheek, the sterile smell of alcohol stinging the air, the samples sealed in small plastic envelopes. Behind that sterile simplicity was the weight of nearly 100 years of doubt. The DNA test revealed Bobby was not a Dunbar. The results were undeniable. The man who had lived and died as Bobby Dunbar shared no blood with the Dunbar family. The boy celebrated in 1913, the child raised in Opelousas, the man who married and fathered children. He was not Bobby. He was Bruce Anderson, Julia Anderson's son. The revelation shook the family like a thunderclap. A century of certainty collapsed in seconds, replaced by a haunting truth. The real Bobby Dunbar had never been found. Had the Dunbars stolen another woman's child? Or had they themselves been victims of hope, so desperate it blinded them to the truth? The state's justice system had been complicit. The court that crowned the boy Bobby had effectively erased Julia Anderson's child from his own life. This wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a legal crime sanctioned by the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. The parallels to today's scandals are chilling. Think of wrongful convictions overturned by DNA decades later, men and women stripped of their lives because powerful systems refuse to admit mistakes. The Dunbar case wasn't an anomaly. It was a prophecy of injustices yet to come. For Margaret, the discovery was bittersweet. She had solved the riddle of her grandfather's identity, but in doing so, she confirmed an even darker mystery. Bobby Dunbar, the real Bobby, had vanished forever into the swamps of Swayze Lake. The curse of the Dunbar case was generational. Families on both sides carried scars. The Dunbars lived with a stolen legacy, while the Andersons lived with the memory of a child stripped from their arms. Neither side could escape the shadow of that verdict. And so the question lingers, what truly happened to the real Bobby Dunbar? If the boy raised as Bobby was really Bruce, then where did the real Bobby Dunbar go? The swamps of Louisiana had already swallowed countless lives by 1912. Alligators, quicksand, and waters so dark they seemed to drink the light whole. Searchers who scoured Swayze Lake after Bobby's disappearance described the air as thick with decay, the sickly sweet stench of rotting vegetation clinging to their clothes. They dragged nets, fired shotguns into the water to stir movement, even gutted alligators in desperation. But the lake gave nothing back. Some believed Bobby drowned that first night. He had wandered too close to the lake, slipped, and vanished beneath the water's black surface before anyone noticed. The miracle recovery, 8 months later, may have been nothing more than a tragic mistake, a cover for a loss too painful to accept. Others weren't convinced. The swamp was merciless, yes, but it rarely erased all traces. No body, no clothing, no definitive sign of Bobby's fate was ever recovered. To some, that silence was suspicious. The kidnapping theory refuses to die. Locals whispered that Bobby had been stolen deliberately, perhaps by drifters moving through Louisiana's backroads, perhaps even by a family who wanted a son of their own. In this version, Bobby wasn't claimed by the swamp, but by strangers who disappeared into the shadows of America's restless South. Which is worse, a child claimed by nature's cruelty, or a child stolen and raised in secret, his identity forever erased? The emotional toll of these theories cannot be overstated. For the Dunbars, accepting the drowning meant admitting they had chased a ghost for 8 months. Accepting the kidnapping meant admitting that their justice system, their community, and even their own judgment had failed them. Either path led only to guilt and grief. Some claim the Dunbars knew all along. This darkest version suggests they suspected from the beginning that the boy they brought home was not their Bobby, but chose to believe the lie because the alternative was unbearable. If true, it wasn't just the courts or the community complicit in the theft of Julia Anderson's son. It was the Dunbars themselves. Modern parallels echo here too. Consider families who cling to false narratives in the wake of scandal, or institutions that cover up uncomfortable truths for the sake of survival. The human instinct to protect pride often outweighs the duty to protect justice. And as the swamp grew silent, one truth remained. Bobby Dunbar's real fate was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. Imagine growing up with a name that was never truly yours. The boy the world knew as Bobby Dunbar carried a shadow over his identity for his entire life. As a child, he seemed playful enough, laughing, running, blending into Opelousas society. But those closest to him noticed something deeper, something unsettling. He rarely spoke of his time lost in the swamp, dodging questions with nervous half-smiles or abrupt changes of subject. Psychologists today might call it imposter trauma, the crushing weight of living a life built on uncertainty. Even if Bobby believed the Dunbars were his family, some part of him must have felt the fracture, the invisible scar of being pulled from one world and planted into another. He avoided his past like a plague. As an adult, Bobby never wanted to talk about the disappearance. Relatives recalled that whenever the subject arose, his eyes grew distant, his tone sharp, as if the very idea of revisiting those years carried a pain too sharp to touch. Silence became his armor, but it also became his prison. His children inherited that silence. They grew up with a father who carried an unspoken burden, a man who seemed both present and absent, like a ghost walking through his own home. The family name Dunbar hung over them like both a crown and a curse. His sense of belonging was fractured. Accounts describe him as restless, even conflicted, caught between two identities: Bruce, the son of Julia Anderson, and Bobby, the heir of the Dunbars. Psychologists argue this duality can create a lifetime of dissonance, where a person never fully feels at home in their own skin. What happens to a child's soul when their very name is stolen? The psychological scars ripple outward. Children raised in false identities often carry anxiety, trust issues, and a lingering fear of abandonment. For Bobby/Bruce, these wounds weren't just personal, they were generational, shaping how his descendants understood themselves and their history. Even in death, he was haunted. When Bobby Dunbar died in 1966, the gravestone bore a name that wasn't his. For decades, family members laid flowers at a grave that carried a stolen identity, a cruel irony that only DNA would one day expose. Modern echoes are striking. Think of adoption scandals, Bobbies switched at birth, or families torn apart by corrupt systems. The Dunbar case is a mirror of those modern tragedies, proof that stolen identity leaves scars that no time or technology can fully heal. But while Bobby lived a lie, Julia Anderson lived a truth no one believed, and her story was even more tragic. She was branded a liar, a fallen woman, and she lost her son forever. Julia Anderson's fight for her child was one of the most tragic chapters in the Bobby Dunbar saga. A mill worker from North Carolina, Julia was poor, unmarried, and vulnerable in a society that measured a woman's worth by her reputation. When she came forward in 1913 to claim that the boy paraded as Bobby Dunbar was in fact her son, Bruce, she walked into a courtroom already stacked against her. The air was heavy with judgment. Men in stiff collars whispered about her immorality. Women in pressed dresses turned their eyes cold. To them, Julia wasn't a grieving mother. She was a scandal, a woman daring to challenge a prominent family with nothing but her word. Witnesses sided with the Dunbars, not the mother. Even though Julia identified her child with certainty, townsfolk, neighbors, and even reporters painted her as untrustworthy. They whispered about her loose character, her lack of wealth, her unmarried status. In the eyes of society, she had already been condemned before she spoke. Her testimony was heartfelt, detailed, filled with love, but every word was dismissed as desperation. Instead of sympathy, Julia was met with mockery, her grief weaponized against her. The court stripped her son away. In one of the most chilling miscarriages of justice in American history, Julia was denied the right to reclaim her own child. The boy was handed to the Dunbars, her motherhood erased by gavel and ink. She returned to North Carolina empty-handed, carrying the hollow ache of loss that no parent should ever endure. What kind of society applauds when power crushes a mother's love? For Julia, life after the trial was marked by whispers and scars. She married later, bore other children, but the wound never healed. Friends recalled her speaking of Bruce often, her eyes clouding with the pain of knowing he was alive but unreachable, growing up in another woman's arms, calling another woman mother. History proved Julia right. Decades later, DNA confirmed what Julia had shouted into the void. The boy was not Bobby Dunbar, but Bruce Anderson. She had been telling the truth all along, yet society had branded her a liar and destroyed her bond with her child. The modern echoes are haunting. Even today, women who challenge powerful men, corporations, or institutions often find themselves discredited, not because they are wrong, but because they are powerless. Julia's humiliation was not an isolated case. It was a warning that echoes across centuries. But the Dunbars didn't just steal Julia's son. They built their entire legacy on him. The Brennan name, once whispered in fear across Lancaster County, seemed to vanish after the hangings. Official records closed the chapter, declaring justice served, and families desperate to move on buried their grief beneath layers of silence. But history has a way of remembering what people try to forget. Each generation that followed carried the scars, some visible, others buried deep, etched into family stories never fully told. Children grew up hearing fragments at the dinner table, tales of mothers lost too young, of widows who remarried too quickly, of farms cursed with endless misfortune. And always, somewhere in the background, the shadow of the Brennans lingered. The silence was not accidental. Local leaders, businesses, and even church officials had reasons to bury the truth. Acknowledging the scale of the crimes meant confronting their own complicity, how they ignored warning signs, how they failed to protect vulnerable women, how they allowed killers to thrive in their midst. Instead, they chose selective memory, highlighting the justice of the executions while erasing the larger conspiracy from sermons, textbooks, and town records. Lancaster County became a community living with a ghost, present but unspoken, real but never addressed. But silence does not erase. In fact, it corrodes. Families who descended from both the victims and the perpetrators inherited fractured identities, caught between shame and sorrow. Some tried to scrub their lineage clean, changing names, moving west, pretending the past had never happened. Others embraced the whispers, almost defiantly, turning the Brennan story into a twisted badge of dark pride, proof that their bloodline once held power enough to terrify an entire county. That duality, denial on one side, obsession on the other, kept the legacy alive, though no one admitted it openly. The true tragedy is that justice, in its final form, remained incomplete. The hangings of a few Brennan members did not dismantle the larger network of greed, corruption, and manipulation. Other families profited quietly from the chaos. Land disputes were settled in the shadows, and some men who aided the Brennans walked free, their reputations untarnished. In many ways, the silence that followed became another form of violence, a collective decision to protect reputations rather than confront reality. Today, researchers who dig into the archives still find gaps, missing court transcripts, edited newspapers, records that mysteriously stop just when the Brennan's influence begins to unravel. These omissions are not accidents. They are evidence of a community determined to bury its darkest truths. Yet the story surfaces again and again because people cannot resist the magnetic pull of unfinished history. The Brennan's crimes were not just acts of violence. They were acts of erasure, attempts to rewrite who lived, who died, and who mattered. And that erasure remains their final legacy. Not just the women they buried, but the silence they left behind. A silence that still asks the question, if history can be rewritten once, how many other times has it already been done? Imagine waking up one morning to discover your entire family fortune was built on a lie so dangerous. It could kill anyone who spoke it aloud. By the early 20th century, the Bobby Dunbar case had already turned into more than just a missing child story. It had become a brutal reflection of how power, greed, and desperation could tear through entire bloodlines. When Percy and Leslie Dunbar finally believed they had their boy back, the world cheered, but deep down, the cracks in the story had already begun to show. The family's relief felt like a thunderstorm breaking over Swayze Lake, deafening, chaotic, and filled with a sense of unnatural electricity in the air. The child who returned could not remember his own home. He screamed at strangers, flinched at his mother's touch, and refused to call Percy father. What kind of reunion is that for a boy supposedly saved from the swamp? The newspapers played it as triumph. Lost boy found after 8 months. But neighbors whispered something darker. Some claimed the Dunbars had convinced themselves of a lie rather than face the shame of losing their son forever. Others believed a curse of mistaken identity had doomed the family to live under a false shadow. Percy Dunbar stood proudly with the child, but his eyes betrayed a storm. Confusion, guilt, and doubt all swirling beneath the surface. Question: was this truly Bobby or the greatest con in Southern history? Another mother came forward, claiming the boy was hers. A woman named Julia Anderson from Mississippi swore that the child was her son, Bruce, not Bobby. Suddenly, what had been a story of rescue turned into a courtroom battle of blood, lies, and shattered identities. In the packed courthouse, the smell of sweat and inked newspapers filled the air as reporters scribbled feverishly. Families were forced to choose sides. Was this Bobby or Bruce? Was this salvation or theft? The court ruled against Julia Anderson, giving the child to the Dunbars. And just like that, history wrote Bobby's name on a boy who might not have been him at all. The echoes of this trial sound eerily familiar in today's scandals. Dynasties protecting their reputations at all costs, from political families covering up affairs to billionaires silencing whistleblowers. The pattern is timeless. Power reshapes truth. The Dunbars got their son back, but peace never returned to Opelousas. Neighbors noticed the boy never quite fit in, never quite carried the same spark as the child who vanished at Swayze Lake. What if your greatest victory, finding your lost child, was the very lie that destroyed your family from within? After the court's decision, Percy and Leslie Dunbar walked out of Opelousas courthouse clutching the boy everyone now called Bobby. Cameras flashed, reporters cheered, but beneath the noise hung an unsettling silence. That night in the Dunbar home, the atmosphere was suffocating, like the heavy musk of wet wood and kerosene lamps, pressing on the chest with every breath. The boy did not behave like Bobby. He refused to play with old toys, shrank back from family pets, and gazed at his supposed mother as though staring at a stranger. To Leslie, this should have been a miracle reunion, but every embrace was stiff, every kiss unanswered. Family members began whispering that the child might be an impostor. Percy silenced them, his voice sharp as a blade. Better to live with a lie than admit the unbearable truth that Bobby was gone. The neighbors grew suspicious too. Some swore they saw Julia Anderson's likeness in the boy's eyes, not the Dunbars. Yet Percy clung to the narrative, feeding it to the press until it hardened into truth. And this is where the psychological curse deepened. The Dunbars were no longer a family, but actors in a play they could never step off from. Leslie's maternal instincts warred with doubt, every lullaby haunted by a whisper, "This isn't my son." The child began to slip into silence. He rarely spoke, avoiding questions about his past. When asked to recall his father's voice or his favorite hiding spot, he turned his face to the wall. Whether this was trauma or evidence of false identity, no one could prove. Did the Dunbars rescue their boy or steal someone else? The story rippled across the South like wildfire, and its echoes can be heard today in modern scandals, families and corporations that would rather protect an image than confront the truth. From politicians fabricating war records to tech giants silencing internal dissent, the Dunbars' desperate gamble became a mirror for generations of cover-ups. Julia Anderson never stopped fighting. Poor, ridiculed, and powerless, she insisted until her last breath that the boy was Bruce, her Bruce. In her eyes, the court had stolen her child and handed him to strangers. By the time the dust settled, the Dunbars had won, but the boy inside their home was a ghost of two lives, one claimed, one lost, and the question of his true name lingered like a curse neither family could escape. What happens when a boy grows into a man, carrying a name that may never have been his? Years passed after the courtroom drama. The boy raised as Bobby Dunbar learned to walk, talk, and live under the Dunbar roof. To the town, he was a symbol of triumph, a child rescued from the swamp's grip. But behind the closed shutters of the family home, the tension was as thick as the Louisiana humidity, clinging to the skin, suffocating, inescapable. Leslie watched him with quiet unease. His mannerisms didn't match her memories. He played differently, favored foods Bobby once hated, and carried a stubborn streak foreign to the boy she had lost. Still, she smiled for photographs, forcing warmth into every staged embrace. As he grew older, even extended family members whispered doubts. Cousins muttered that he looked more like Julia Anderson than Percy Dunbar. Old friends avoided questions, afraid of the storm Percy's temper would unleash. The boy, whether Bobby or Bruce, was caught in a psychological prison. Imagine being told you are someone you may not be every day of your life. His childhood became a performance, and his adolescence a battlefield of identity. At night, he would stare at the ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead, the wooden blades creaking like a clock ticking down a secret truth. The supposed Bobby himself began to doubt. By his teenage years, he confessed to friends that he sometimes felt like he didn't belong in his own skin. But to question his identity was to unravel the Dunbars, fragile reality, and Percy would not allow it. How long can a family live a lie before it consumes them? This theme echoes chillingly in today's dynasties. Children of billionaires raised under manufactured legacies, or heirs forced to inherit names and roles that suffocate their true selves. The Dunbar case was less about a missing child and more about the price of protecting reputation over truth. When the Bobby of the Dunbars became a father himself, his children inherited the shadow of the lie. They grew up telling neighbors, "We are the Dunbars, we survived tragedy." But deep inside, the seed of doubt gnawed at their bloodline. Was their father truly Bobby Dunbar, or the orphan child of Julia Anderson? The man carried the Dunbar name to his grave. But decades later, science would rise from the shadows, threatening to expose everything Percy and Leslie had fought to hide. Nearly a century later, science dug up a truth the courts had buried alive. For generations, the Dunbars lived under the shadow of a name, Bobby. To the outside world, their family was a symbol of resilience, of triumph over tragedy. But inside, the whispers never stopped. At reunions, over dinner tables, and in quiet conversations by the fire, the same question lingered like a ghost. Was he really Bobby Dunbar? By the 1990s, those whispers had sharpened into a demand for answers. The world had changed. DNA testing had become the ultimate weapon against doubt. And the Dunbars, now spread across the South, decided to confront the curse that had haunted them for nearly a century. A direct descendant of the man raised as Bobby agreed to give his DNA. The test was compared against the bloodline of the Dunbars, Percy and Leslie's true descendants. The results arrived like a thunderclap in a quiet storm. There was no genetic link. The man who lived his entire life as Bobby Dunbar was not related to the Dunbars at all. He was, in fact, Julia Anderson's son, most likely Bruce. The revelation shattered a century-old lie. The photographs of Bobby smiling with Percy and Leslie suddenly looked staged, tragic. The man who had carried their name had been a living monument to falsehood. His laughter, his family, his legacy, built on an identity stolen by desperation. The moment the results were revealed, descendants of both families described the sensation as a gut punch. "It was like the ground shifted under us," one said, recalling how decades of certainty collapsed in a single piece of paper. Even the air in the room felt heavy, like a grave had been opened. Question: did Percy and Leslie knowingly lie, or did grief blind them to the truth? Julia Anderson had been right all along. The poor, uneducated woman mocked by courts and newspapers had told the truth, but no one wanted to believe her. In a cruel twist of fate, her voice was buried, and history chose the richer family's narrative. This mirrors today's scandals, where wealth and influence decide truth more than evidence. From corporate frauds to political cover-ups, the Dunbar case feels disturbingly modern, a cautionary tale of what happens when power rewrites reality. The truth was out, but it came too late for Julia, too late for the man who lived as Bobby, and too late for the real Bobby Dunbar, whose true fate remains an unsolved mystery. If the boy who lived as Bobby wasn't him, then what happened to the real Bobby Dunbar? When DNA erased a century of certainty, it didn't just rewrite one family's history, it reopened a wound that had never healed. If Bruce Anderson had been raised under the Dunbar name, then the original Bobby, the child who vanished on that August day in 1912, was still missing. His fate had been buried beneath layers of lies, courtroom battles, and newspaper headlines. The people of Opelousas began whispering again, as though the ghost of Bobby had returned to stir the waters of Swayze Lake. The swamp itself, with its heavy stench of rotting reeds and its constant hum of cicadas, seemed to carry the unanswered question on the wind. Where was Bobby? Some theorists believed Bobby drowned that very first day. The alligator-infested lake had been a death trap for generations of children, and many whispered that Percy and Leslie had clung to a false Bobby, rather than face the unbearable grief of a body lost forever in the swamp. Others, however, were not convinced. Darker rumors suggested foul play. Some claimed Bobby may have been abducted not by a drifter, but by someone closer to the family. The fact that the search was oddly delayed, the inconsistencies in Percy's accounts, and the rushed court decision fed speculation that powerful hands wanted the truth buried. Was Bobby Dunbar a victim of tragedy or of conspiracy? Theories swirled like smoke. One pointed to William Cantwell Walters, the handyman who had been accused of kidnapping. Walters always swore the boy was Bruce Anderson, not Bobby, and history has now vindicated him. But if Walters was innocent, then Bobby's disappearance was never solved. Even Bobby's descendants admitted they may never know the truth. For them, the story had shifted from family pride to generational curse, a legacy of doubt, falsehood, and grief. This story resonates eerily today in cases where missing children are still claimed by desperate families, sometimes wrongly, sometimes in denial. It mirrors modern scandals where truth is twisted by fear of shame, from governments hiding battlefield deaths to corporations erasing workplace disasters. The case of Bobby Dunbar remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. His body was never found. His voice was never heard again. And all that remains is a swamp, a lie, and a question that refuses to die. The Dunbar curse didn't end in 1912. It still whispers through every family that hides behind a lie. The story of Bobby Dunbar closes not with a solution, but with a void, a century-long silence where truth should have lived. The boy who vanished at Swayze Lake was never found. The boy who returned was proven decades later to be someone else. And in between, two families, Dunbar and Anderson, were torn apart by a court's decision, by public opinion, and by the desperate need to preserve appearances. The Dunbars raised a child who was not their own. Julia Anderson lost a son to strangers. And the real Bobby remains a shadow, his fate lost to the swamp, to history, or to something darker that no one dared admit. The case didn't just destroy two families. It reshaped American true crime itself. Newspapers of the 1910s sensationalized the story, twisting Julia into a villain, glorifying the Dunbars, and creating a template for media-driven trials that still haunts courtrooms today. Even after the DNA revealed the truth, some descendants of the Dunbars still refuse to accept it. For them, it was safer to live inside the myth than confront a century-old lie. That is the true curse, denial passed down like an heirloom. How many of our own histories are built on lies we've simply chosen to believe? The legacy of Bobby Dunbar's disappearance feels disturbingly modern. From families hiding generational scandals to corporations covering disasters, the lesson is the same. When truth threatens comfort, power often buries it. The swamp of Swayze Lake is no different from today's headlines. It devours evidence, muffles voices, and leaves only questions behind. The sensory weight of this mystery lingers. Imagine the thick night air of Louisiana, the sound of frogs croaking in the reeds, and the heavy silence where a child's laughter should have been. That silence is the true inheritance of the Dunbars and the Andersons. The Bobby Dunbar case remains unsolved, an open wound in America's history of missing children. He is both everywhere and nowhere, alive in photographs, erased in fact. And perhaps that is why the story refuses to die.